She wasn't wearing a uniform. She wasn't shouting orders. But when a white cop handcuffed this calm, older black woman outside a courthouse, he had no idea she was a U.S. Army general or that one phone call would bring the Pentagon to its knees. What happens when quiet power meets loud prejudice? If this caught your attention, hit the like button, share the story, and don't forget to subscribe to MMAX Stories for more true inspired stories that make you think. Now let's step into the moment everything went wrong. It was just past 9 in the morning when Althea Monroe pulled into the cracked parking lot of the Monroe County Courthouse. The sun had barely cleared the rooftops, but the air already carried that slow southern heat that pressed down on everything it touched. Her vehicle, a dull-weathered military SUV with no shine left on the paint, looked like it belonged to someone who didn't care to impress anyone. She stepped out slowly, one hand closing the heavy door behind her, the other adjusting the sleeve of her beige blouse. No uniform, no rank, just calm. But there was something in the way she moved that didn't match the small-town rhythm around her. Her back was straight, her pace, even her eyes scanning everything without ever looking rushed. She didn't speak. She didn't smile. She didn't need to. You could tell in an instant this woman had been through things most folks would never begin to understand. Officer Grant Holloway was leaning on his squad car across the lot, sipping a convenience store coffee like he did every Tuesday morning. His eyes narrowed the second he saw her. It wasn't anything she did. It was how she did nothing at all. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't lost. She walked like she owned her time, and that alone was enough to rattle a man like Holloway. A black woman in a government vehicle alone, dressed in plain clothes, walking like the ground didn't question her. That wasn't something he saw in this town. And he didn't like what he didn't recognize. She didn't get more than 20 feet before he stepped forward, one hand on his belt, his voice sharp but steady. "Ma'am, can I help you with something?" Althea stopped, turned toward him, and nodded once. "No help needed, officer. I'm here for a quick renewal at the DMV." Her voice was low, even. No edge, no warmth either, just fact. Holloway took a few steps closer. He didn't smile. His tone carried the kind of authority that doesn't wait to be invited. "Mind telling me where you got this vehicle?" She turned slightly enough to glance back at the SUV, then met his eyes without flinching. "It's registered to me. Military use, plates current. Still gonna need to see your ID." She didn't hesitate. She reached into her bag slowly, deliberately, and handed him a laminated card. He stared at it. Then back at her. The name matched. The photo matched. But something in him refused to settle. "Monroe, huh? That's funny. You from around here?" "No, sir." "Ever been arrested before?" "No, sir." "Any weapons in the car?" "No, sir." Each answer was clean, precise. He couldn't find a crack in her, and that made him dig harder. There was no reason to stop her. Not really. But the longer she stood there, not defensive, not deferential, the more he needed to find one. The wind picked up slightly, brushing her blouse against her frame. Holloway looked down at the ID again, then up at her face. Her posture hadn't shifted once. Most people, when questioned by a cop, even politely carry some sort of nervous tension in their shoulders or eyes. But Althea, she stood like a mountain. He handed the ID back without a word, but he didn't step away. "You military?" "Yes." "What branch?" "Army." He nodded slowly, clearly not satisfied. "You active?" "I'm still in service, yes." There was a pause. He couldn't place it, but something about her presence was eating at him. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't bragging or defensive, and somehow that was more threatening than someone who shouted. From the corner of the lot, a few passers-by glanced over. Nothing looked wrong on the surface, just a routine stop, a couple of questions. But the air had changed. It felt thick, heavy, like something had shifted under the sidewalk and no one could quite name what. Holloway finally spoke again. "I'm gonna need you to stay right here while I run your plate." She didn't move. "I've done nothing wrong." "Didn't say you did. Just need to check a few things." And with that, he turned and walked back toward his patrol car, leaving her standing in that patch of sun hands, relaxed at her sides, eyes still and quiet. And there was nothing loud about that moment. No raised voices, no violence. But if you were there, you'd feel it. The tension wasn't in what was said. It was in what was refused to be explained, refused to be accepted. Something about her didn't fit the picture he was used to, and instead of asking why, he chose to search for a reason to treat her like a threat. No one watching that moment could have guessed what she really was, or how far this ordinary stop would go. But from the very first glance, you could tell something was about to go wrong. Officer Holloway didn't move right away. He stood still for a few seconds, as if waiting for something in his gut to confirm what his eyes already told him, that this woman didn't belong here. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she didn't look unsure. She didn't ask questions. She didn't show fear. And that alone was enough to disturb the balance he thought he understood. He finally walked back toward her with measured steps and held out his hand again. "Let me see your military ID." Althea didn't flinch. She reached into her bag with calm precision and pulled out a card that had clearly seen years of use, faded edges, a photo clipped from long ago, the unmistakable layout of official military identification. He held the card between his fingers, stared at it too long, then gave a low, dismissive chuckle. "Well, I'll give you this. It's a pretty convincing fake." Althea said nothing for a moment. She slowly took the card back, returned it to her wallet, and looked him square in the eye. "You're standing on the wrong side of history." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. Holloway looked unsettled for the first time. Not because she'd threatened him, but because she hadn't. Her silence, her poise, it all challenged something deep inside him that he couldn't explain. So he did what people often do when they feel powerless. He tried to reassert control. He turned on his radio, requesting a second unit at my location, just a backup. The voice on the other end crackled. "Do you have a situation?" Holloway hesitated. Call it a gut feeling. No further explanation, and none required. Minutes later, a second patrol car pulled into the lot. Officer Luis Ramos stepped out, young, fresh-faced, barely out of academy training. His uniform still looked too crisp, and his eyes scanned the scene with the hesitance of someone learning where power lives in silence. He walked toward Holloway, glanced at Althea, and paused. There was something off. She stood without tension, hands visible, expression neutral, but the air around her felt pressurized like a room slowly losing oxygen. He'd seen traffic stops before. This wasn't one of them. This was something else. Something that didn't belong in the manual. Ramos leaned toward Holloway, his voice low. "Is there something wrong?" Holloway didn't look away from Althea. "She's got military ID, says she's active, but I'm not buying it. You think it's fake? I think she's hiding something." Ramos looked again. The woman was still composed, standing like someone who'd waded through worse. "She's been calm the whole time," he asked. Too calm. That answer hung heavy in the space between them. Ramos didn't push further. He didn't agree, but he also didn't challenge. He just stood there now, part of something that made him uncomfortable, but not enough to step outside of it. Althea hadn't said another word since her warning. She didn't pace. She didn't plead. She simply waited. And in that stillness was a message more powerful than any protest. It said, "I know who I am. The question is, do you?" A breeze swept across the lot, rustling the papers on Holloway's dashboard, but even the wind couldn't clear the tension that had settled between the three of them. There was no shouting, no sirens, nothing outwardly violent, but if you'd been standing there, you would have felt it. You would have felt how close the pressure was to breaking. You would have known that this wasn't about a license plate or a routine check. This was about something far older than either badge on their chests, and something deeper than either man could name aloud. Because when skin speaks louder than rank, it doesn't matter how many stars you've earned, some people only ever see the color that comes first. Officer Grant Holloway took another step forward, this time with less patience than before. He held out his hand again, signaling for ID. Althea didn't argue. Calmly, she reached into her bag, pulled out a worn military identification card, its edges faded. Its plastic softened with time, but the layout still clear and unmistakably official. Holloway held it between his fingers, flipping it once, then again. He stared at it like he was looking for a lie hidden in the corners. Then he let out a dry, almost amused chuckle. "Well, he said that's a pretty convincing fake." Althea took a breath, not sharp, not dramatic. Just one long, quiet breath. Then she gently took the card back, slipped it into her wallet, and raised her eyes to meet his. "You're standing on the wrong side of history." She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She said it like a fact delivered without threat, without fear, but with weight that settled over the space between them like a storm cloud you didn't see coming. For a beat, Holloway seemed thrown off, just for a second. And then, like flipping a switch, he turned away and spoke into his radio, requesting backup to my location. Nothing urgent, just a gut feeling. The dispatcher asked for details. He didn't offer any. Just backup, he repeated. Trust me. A few minutes passed. A second patrol car eased into the lot, headlights cutting through the morning haze. Officer Luis Ramos stepped out, his uniform crisp movements, careful, still green around the edges. He walked over, young and unsure, his eyes scanning the scene, landing on the older black woman standing so still she could have been carved from stone. Holloway briefed him quickly, said the ID didn't sit right with him, said something felt off, said she was too calm. Ramos didn't say much back. He looked at Althea again, her posture steady, her hands relaxed, no panic, no rush, just presence. Like she knew something they didn't. Like she'd been through worse than this, and all of this was just noise. Do you think it's fake? Ramos asked quietly. Holloway didn't blink. I think she's hiding something. She's not resisting, Ramos said. She's being calculated, Holloway replied. That's the difference. That word calculated hung there like smoke refusing to rise. Ramos stepped back. He didn't challenge it, but he didn't agree either. He just watched, observing like a student in a situation that wasn't in the training manual. He could feel something was wrong, but he wasn't yet the kind of man who'd say it out loud. Althea said nothing more. She hadn't spoken since her warning. She just stood there, eyes steady, jaw relaxed, her silence saying more than words ever could. It was a silence full of history, of patience worn thin, of dignity withheld from the fire because fire never needed to prove itself to smoke. And yet her stillness didn't make the air any lighter. Holloway grew more rigid. Ramos grew more uncertain. The lot was quiet, but the tension thickened like fog pulling in from every direction. A light breeze moved through the space, carrying with it the hum of distant traffic and the soft rattle of paper on the dash of Holloway's cruiser. But even that wind couldn't cut through the weight pressing down on the moment. To someone watching from the outside, it might have looked uneventful. No shouting, no struggle. Just a woman and two officers. But if you were there, really there, you'd feel it. You'd feel the press of suspicion that didn't come from facts. You'd sense how one woman's calm could unsettle men who didn't understand strength without volume. You'd know deep down that this wasn't about a license plate or an ID card. It was about who gets questioned and who gets believed. It wasn't loud, but it was deafening. This wasn't protocol. This was presumption. This wasn't law. This was reflex. And when skin starts speaking louder than rank, when quiet dignity is seen as threat instead of proof of control, it doesn't matter what kind of medals you've earned or how many wars you've fought. Because in that moment, to some people, you're not a general. You're just a question they don't want answered. Althea knew it, and maybe that's why she stayed silent. Not out of fear, but because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need time to unfold, one misunderstanding, one stare, one assumption at a time. The room where they placed her wasn't built for shame, but it held it all the same. The overhead light buzzed softly, casting a cold white glare across every surface, giving everything, chairs, walls, even people, a kind of clinical detachment. Althea sat alone on a metal bench, her back straight, her hands resting gently in her lap. No handcuffs, no signs of resistance. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Through the glass, Officer Holloway watched her like someone trying to decode a foreign language. He stood stiffly with a clipboard in hand, scratching out words he knew would never hold water in court, but sounded official enough on paper. Disturbing the peace, failure to comply, suspicious behavior, phrases designed to cover discomfort more than misconduct. But the silence coming from that room, it was starting to feel personal, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, heavy like a clock ticking in a room where no one wanted to know the time. Officer Luis Ramos stood nearby, younger, quieter, but his eyes were sharp. He kept glancing back at her, something twisting just slightly in his chest every time he did. He couldn't explain it, but he was certain this didn't feel like justice. It didn't even feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like a moment being shaped by the wrong hands. Then a female officer walked in, soft-voiced and measured. "Would you like to make a phone call, ma'am?" Althea lifted her eyes, calm as still water. "I only need 17 seconds. The room didn't react, not immediately. The officer blinked, confused by the precision. Holloway scoffed. 17 seconds, huh? He muttered, handing the phone over with mock generosity. Let's see what you can do with that. She didn't look at him. She didn't respond at all. She took the phone, carefully dialed a number from memory, and waited as the line clicked once, then again. Her voice didn't rise. Her tone didn't shift. This is Monroe. That was all she said. No context, no plea, just her name spoken plainly. 6 seconds passed in silence. She nodded once to no one in particular, then placed the receiver back on its cradle. Total time 17 seconds. She returned to her seat with the same composure, folding her hands once more like she'd never moved. The stillness around her deepened, and that was when something shifted, not loud, not visible, but real. Ramos straightened slightly, his instincts flickering in the silence. Something in her eyes made him uneasy, not fearful, but curious. Like she was already aware of a conversation none of them were hearing, a decision already in motion. He looked over at Holloway, who was suddenly less smug, suddenly unsure whether he'd just watched a bluff or lit a fuse. The walls didn't tremble. There was no sound of boots or radios crackling, but the air changed. It thickened in the way it does right before a summer storm. Not violent, not chaotic, just waiting. Ramos shifted again. He wanted to ask. He wanted to say something didn't feel right, but he stayed silent, his training pulling him one way while his gut screamed another. And Althea, she said nothing more. Because power, the kind that doesn't need to introduce itself, doesn't fill space with noise. It fills it with inevitability. Real power doesn't shout. It doesn't need to. It just waits, knowing that when it moves, the room will move with it. And in that small, quiet moment, something irreversible had begun. They just didn't know it yet. The silence had settled like a sheet of ice, fragile, deceptive, waiting for the first crack. Althea Monroe sat as if nothing had happened. Her breath steady, her posture unchanging. The weight of the 17-second phone call lingered in the air, though no one could say why. Even the soft mechanical hum of the air vent seemed to hold its breath. Luis Ramos leaned against the wall, arms crossed tighter now, eyes flicking occasionally toward her. He couldn't make sense of it, not fully. There had been no argument, no plea, just a name, a tone, and a number that rolled off her fingers like it had been memorized during war. He didn't know what Tango Echo 15 meant, but the way she said it made it sound less like a code and more like a trigger. Holloway, on the other hand, couldn't stop the smirk crawling across his face. He chuckled under his breath, loud enough to be heard, but quiet enough to pretend he wasn't being disrespectful. To him, it was the same old dance, someone bluffing rank-pulling strings that didn't exist. "She's got all of you shook over a phone call," he muttered. 17 seconds of nonsense. Luis didn't answer, because something told him deep down this wasn't nonsense. 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. No raised voices, no foot traffic in the hall, just the slow ticking of the wall clock above the front desk and the occasional shift of a radio channel with no message behind it. Then, a sound, soft, mechanical. The fax machine. It was never fast, never dramatic. Just that slow grind as the rollers pulled a single sheet through. The paper curled from the tray like a whisper in the dark. No one moved to grab it. Not at first. Then the front desk sergeant walked over. She glanced at the page, blinked, then read again. Her fingers curled around it tightly, and without a word she turned and walked straight to the back office. Seconds later, the phones started ringing, one, then another. Desk lines that barely rang twice a day suddenly lit up like it was Christmas. Dispatch, captain's line, admin, every phone vibrating, chiming, singing in dissonant alarm. Holloway stood uncertain now, the confidence from earlier leaking out in quiet beads of sweat down his neck. He looked at Luis. What the hell is going on? Luis didn't answer. He didn't need to, because something was happening, something that felt bigger than them both. The front doors opened. It wasn't loud, no shouting, no rush, just a single pair of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing against the tile floor. It was Chief Masterson, a man they rarely saw outside of press events or retirement ceremonies. He looked older than his file photo, but the wear on his face came from battles they couldn't begin to imagine. Some in uniform, others behind desks. His presence carried weight, authority. But tonight it carried something else too. Regret. He stepped into the center of the station, glanced once at Ramos, once at Holloway, and then finally toward the room where Althea sat. His voice came out low hoarse like it hadn't been used in hours, but remembered exactly how it needed to sound. Major General Monroe. The words landed like bricks in the room. Ramos felt it first. That flush of understanding crashing into him all at once. His stomach sank. His chest rose. Everything snapped into place. Holloway for a second didn't breathe. The title was unmistakable. Major General. The kind of rank you didn't bluff. The kind of position that required confirmation hearings, decades of service classified operations. A level that didn't just carry respect, it carried infrastructure. And he'd cuffed her, mocked her, ignored every signal that should have stopped him in his tracks. Chief Masterson continued, "Ma'am, we received direct orders from the Pentagon to release you immediately. I've been instructed to convey our sincerest apologies on behalf of the department," and he paused, his voice catching for a split second the United States Army. Althea stood slowly. She didn't adjust her jacket, didn't speak. She simply met the chief's gaze with the calm of someone who had long ago stopped needing to prove herself. "I understand," she said, her voice even, "but I don't accept." Masterson blinked, unsure how to respond. She turned to Luis next. "Not Holloway. Luis. There's still time to choose the right side of history," she said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear, just long enough to plant a seed that wouldn't stop growing. Then she walked past them all, not rushing, not dramatic, just resolute. Like someone who had already been here before. Like someone who had always known this moment would come and had simply waited for the rest of them to catch up. And in the space she left behind, no one moved, no one spoke. The only thing louder than the silence was the shame. No one understood why the room suddenly felt heavier. Nothing had changed, not visibly. The lights still buzzed softly. The clock still ticked. And Althea Monroe still sat in perfect silence, legs crossed, posture composed as if she were the one in control all along. Officer Holloway paced behind the front desk, that arrogant tilt still hanging on his mouth, but now it twitched just slightly. "She thinks she's clever," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Luis Ramos to hear. Luis didn't respond. His eyes were on her. On the stillness that didn't feel like surrender. On the kind of calm that comes from knowing exactly who you are when no one else does. Then Althea looked up. For the first time since she sat down, her voice broke through the silence. "I'd like to make one call." Holloway laughed, dry and sharp. "Sure, one call. You gonna ring the White House?" She didn't blink. "That won't be necessary." The desk sergeant hesitated, but eventually slid her the phone. Althea lifted the receiver slowly, as if she were setting something precise into motion. She dialed a number from memory, then closed her eyes. "General Devereaux," she said. "Tango Echo 15. I'm being held." That was it. 17 seconds. She hung up. No drama, no shouting, just a whisper sent into the right ear. Holloway clapped his hands together mockingly. "Wow, what a show. Let me guess that was your bridge club?" Althea turned toward him for the first time and spoke calmly. "You just started a chain reaction that ends with your badge on the floor." Luis stiffened. Something about her tone, it wasn't anger. It wasn't a bluff. It was a guarantee. Then the air changed. Phones started ringing. First one, then 3, then all of them. The fax machine coughed once word to life and began spitting out a sheet with thick, urgent strokes. Luis crossed the room. He reached the tray just as the paper rolled out. His hand froze. "Officer Ramos," the desk sergeant called. He turned slowly, holding the paper like it had burned him. "It's from the Department of Defense." What Holloway's voice cracked. Luis read aloud. "Immediate release order. Major General Althea Monroe. Pentagon clearance confirmed. Detain no further." Holloway's face turned a sickly shade of gray. "No, this has to be some mistake." But before he could finish, the front doors burst open. Not slammed, not rushed, just wide enough to let in Chief Masterson, his coat barely over his uniform eyes, red from being woken by a call no one ever expects. He walked straight to Holloway. Didn't ask questions, didn't check notes. His voice was cold. Gravel. "Where is she?" Holloway opened his mouth to explain, but Masterson raised a hand. Not a word. He turned toward the holding room and saw her. She was already standing. "Major General Monroe," he said, voice quieter now, but still trembling with weight. "On behalf of this department and the United States Army, I deeply apologize." Holloway's jaw dropped. "Wait, she's actually..." Althea turned to him. For the first time, her voice cut through the room like a blade. "You didn't see a woman. You saw a problem." She took a slow step forward. "You didn't hear my voice. You heard a threat." Another step. "But the worst part isn't what you did." She stood in front of him now, face level, unwavering. "It's that you still don't understand why it was wrong." Holloway tried to speak, but no sound came out. Louise stepped aside. Masterson lowered his gaze. "And Althea?" She adjusted the sleeve of her coat, then looked over her shoulder one last time. "To all of you who stayed silent, you're not off the hook." And with that, she walked out. No escort, no hesitation, just quiet thunder following every step. And behind her, the sound of the system cracking. One officer at a time. Luis Ramos stood there longer than he realized, still holding the release order in his hand, though he wasn't reading it anymore. The words were burned into his brain. But it wasn't the paper that haunted him. It was her eyes. That look she gave Holloway, and then him. It wasn't angry. It wasn't even disappointed. It was something else entirely. Something like a mirror reflecting who they really were. And for Luis, that reflection was uncomfortable. He remembered her name now. Not just from tonight. From training. From that one required module on conflict de-escalation where her name had been spoken like a story most cadets didn't believe was true. General Althea Monroe, his instructor had said. Red Zone negotiator. 2 tours in territories where people didn't come back with their minds intact. She once ended a hostage standoff in Liberia using nothing but a map and her silence. At the time, Luis thought it was just a legend. But now, watching her walk past him, unfolding her sleeve with the kind of grace that doesn't seek revenge, but radiates legacy, he knew it wasn't a legend. It was history walking in real time. Across the room, Holloway stood frozen. He looked like a man who had lost something he didn't know he still had. There was no yelling, no sudden breakdown, just a slow unraveling of the certainty he'd always carried. The kind of certainty that comes from never being challenged. He reached toward his badge, but his fingers never touched it, because deep down he knew it was already gone. Althea didn't speak to him again, didn't offer a last word or a moral to carry home. She simply turned, stepped toward the front door, and paused beside Luis. Their eyes met. She didn't salute. She didn't thank him. She just nodded. A small, barely visible movement. But to Luis it felt heavier than a medal. He didn't return the gesture. He couldn't. Not yet. Because in that second, he realized something that would stay with him far longer than the sound of the phones or the sight of the chief's face when he walked in. She had never needed a uniform. That was the problem. They didn't see it because they weren't trained to look past the obvious. To them, power wore badges, buttons, stars. To her, power wore dignity. She stepped out into the cold night. No escort, no flash. And the door swung shut behind her with the quiet finality of a judge's gavel. Inside, no one moved for a long time. The officers at their desks didn't return to paperwork. The radios stayed on but silent. The coffee in the pot went cold. Even Holloway, now seated like a ghost of himself, didn't speak. Luis finally looked down at the floor, then over at the empty chair where she had sat just minutes earlier. Not a trace of her remained. But the room had changed. Not because she made a scene, but because she didn't need to. She didn't scream. She didn't retaliate. She didn't demand headlines or apologies or fear. She just walked in as herself and walked out as a reminder that the uniform they failed to see was never on her body. It was in her spine. By sunrise, the silence was no longer quiet. It began with a single upload. No headlines, no edits, just a shaky, unfiltered phone video posted at 1:14 a.m. by Jada Hill. The caption read, "Only this happened in our town tonight." At first, it was just a few dozen views. People who couldn't sleep, night shift workers, locals who recognized the police station wall in the background. But something about the way the woman stood there, calm, still in handcuffs, unmoved by chaos, made people stop scrolling. Then came a comment, a quiet ripple in the feed. Ron Alvarez, retired Marine Corps, Silver Star, Kandahar. He wrote, "She carried my commanding officer through gunfire with a dislocated shoulder. Said nothing. Moved like gravity didn't touch her. We thought she was a myth. There were no hashtags, no photos, just that comment, and it caught fire. Because myths don't usually get arrested. By noon, the post had been shared thousands of times. A veteran group reposted it with the words, 'If you know, you know.' Then another added, 'She saved my life in '04. Now who's saving her?' Hashtags followed. One stuck. Rachti never raised her voice. Not because it was clever, because it was true. She didn't raise her voice when they questioned her ID, not when they tightened the cuffs, not even when they laughed in her face. She just made one call and the Pentagon called back. By early afternoon, the local affiliate WKRX aired a special segment titled, "Who is Major General Althea Monroe?" They pieced together military footage from embedded war reporters, grainy but clear her briefing troops in Kandahar, stabilizing wounded civilians in Sierra Leone, walking beside diplomats in places maps don't always name. The reporter's voice trembled slightly as she said, "This woman didn't just serve. She changed outcomes in regions the world had given up on." They played Jada's clip at the end of the segment, followed by Ron's comment, then silence. Then the anchor leaned in and said, "This is not just a story about a mistaken arrest. This is a test of character, of how quickly we judge by skin, not history, of whether we remember what service looks like when it's dressed in quiet." Meanwhile, another post went viral. It was a faded page from a field journal uploaded by a former Army captain named Denise Waller. She had served under Monroe during a hostage standoff in Syria. The page read, "Monroe never shouted. She didn't threaten. She just said, 'If we don't protect the people first, we don't deserve to wear this flag.'" The warlord lowered his weapon. That was the end of it. That sentence, "We don't deserve to wear this flag," got printed on t-shirts within 48 hours. People who had never heard of Althea Monroe before now whispered her name in checkout lines. Teachers printed her quotes and taped them to classroom doors. Churches held prayer circles not just for her, but for what her story said about who we were becoming. Even the mayor, who had been silent until now, released a statement that felt less like a speech and more like an apology. If a woman can lead peace across oceans, she deserves dignity on our streets. That afternoon, someone took a photo of the outside of the station where she had been held. They'd left flowers on the steps, and a note, just 5 words scrawled in permanent marker. She walked out. We woke up. And so a single moment, quiet, filmed in bad lighting, posted by a teenage girl, became something else entirely. It became a mirror, not just for the town, not just for the officers, for all of us. And maybe that's why no one could look away, because it wasn't about Althea Monroe anymore. It was about who we choose to believe, who we choose to listen to, and who we become when we get it wrong. It didn't take long. The moment the Pentagon confirmed Althea Monroe's identity, the first crack in the system appeared like lightning across dry ground. Before the sun rose the next morning, Officer Grant Holloway's badge number was flagged in the internal database. By midday, his gun was locked in an evidence drawer and he was gone. Not escorted, not marched out. Just told not to come back. No press release, no apology, just a short surgical notice: Officer Holloway has been suspended indefinitely pending review. But the town didn't need an official statement to understand what had happened. Word spread like spilled gasoline near a flame, and the spark had already been lit. The local paper didn't print his name, but it didn't have to. Decorated black general, illegally detained in hometown police blunder. That headline was enough. People connected the dots. Fast. By the time the evening news rolled in, the coffee shop on Main Street had already pulled his Officer of the Year plaque off the wall. One barista said quietly, "We don't honor men who humiliate heroes." No one argued. Even his supporters went quiet. Former classmates, neighbors, old coaches, folks who used to call him a good guy having a tough day now, chose not to speak at all. Because defending him meant confronting something uglier than they were ready to face. Then came the cases. Old ones, forgotten ones. Dozens of arrest reports bearing his name, each with vague phrases like "refused to comply" or "aggressive attitude." People started coming forward. One black teenager remembered being cuffed for asking too many questions. A war veteran said Holloway once accused him of stealing his own car. Back then, no one listened. Now everyone listened. News anchors raised eyebrows. Civil rights lawyers reopened files. One local journalist ran a Sunday special titled, "What Happens When Power Thinks It's Never Wrong?" That was the moment the city turned. The police union didn't hold a press conference. They just stopped returning his calls. And then the final silence came. Not from his superiors or his friends, from the world around him. His name was scrubbed from training manuals. His face vanished from recruitment posters. He became what no officer ever wants to be, a cautionary tale no one dared to name. And yet, through all the fallout, Althea never said a word to the press. She didn't demand a trial. She didn't chase cameras. She let the silence speak for her. And it thundered louder than any lawsuit ever could. Because the deepest punishment isn't a verdict. It's knowing that the system you once stood for now refuses to stand with you. And somewhere in that same town, life moved on. But not for Holloway. He heard the silence every morning when the phone didn't ring. He saw it in the eyes of people who once nodded with pride, now pretending they didn't see him at all. He lived it every time someone whispered her name with reverence. And no one mentioned his again. Not every fall makes noise. Some just leave echoes that never stop ringing. It didn't take long. The moment the Pentagon verified her identity, cracks began to form in the very walls Grant Holloway thought would always protect him. Before sunrise the next morning, his badge number was flagged. By noon, his nameplate was quietly removed from the precinct door. No escort, no explanation, just a folded memo handed over a desk. Officer Holloway is suspended indefinitely pending review. But the town already knew. They didn't need a press conference. The story was everywhere. Decorated black general illegally detained by local police. That headline did all the heavy lifting. People remembered her name now, General Althea Monroe, the woman who stared down injustice without raising her voice. And they remembered his too, but not in the way they once had. At the corner cafe where Holloway used to get free coffee, the barista silently took down his framed photo from the wall. The plaque underneath Officer of the Year 2022 was pulled and tossed into the back room. Someone taped a handwritten note in its place. Integrity isn't what you wear. It's what you do when no one's watching. That afternoon, the department began reviewing his arrest history. What used to be minor red flags now looked like sirens. Multiple complaints filed, all quietly dismissed at the time, now reread with fresh eyes. Reports of suspicious behavior, non-compliance, verbal resistance, all centered on black or brown civilians. One woman said she'd been cuffed in front of her daughter for asking too many questions. A retired Marine said Holloway once told him, "You people are good at pretending you serve." Back then, no one listened. Now everyone listened. Journalists took interest. Civil rights groups requested files. A local newspaper ran the headline, "The Day Our Town Forgot Who Protects Who." And just like that, Grant Holloway became a ghost. Not fired, not arrested, just erased. The department didn't defend him. The union stayed quiet. His name faded from public view not because of a court decision, but because people chose to forget him. Not out of mercy, out of discomfort. And Althea, she said nothing. She didn't give interviews. She didn't sue. She didn't return the media's calls. She simply let the truth exist in the open. And that somehow was louder than any speech. Her silence didn't just hold power, it carried weight. Because when a woman like Althea Monroe refuses to shout, the world leans in to listen. Holloway heard it too, in the way his phone stopped ringing, in the way his neighbors crossed the street, in the way even his own reflection wouldn't meet his eyes. Sometimes the system doesn't collapse with an explosion. Sometimes it just goes quiet, and in that quiet, justice settles in. Grant Holloway found it just after dawn, wedged in the crack of his front door like something left by the wind. A plain black envelope. No return address, no markings. But the moment he touched it, he knew it wasn't junk. It was heavy, not in weight, but in intent. He tore it open with the edge of uncertainty creeping down his spine. Inside were 3 photographs. In the first, he was caught mid-action handcuffing Althea Monroe, his face contorted in tension, his grip too firm. In the second, she stood tall, even as the cuffs clicked, her gaze level and proud, untouched by fear or submission. The third, pulled back wider, revealed the crowd watching silently, Jada among them, her phone held up. Officer Luis Ramos, frozen at the edge of the frame, his conscience visibly torn. Then came the note, just one line printed in crisp black ink, unsigned. "You didn't hurt me, Officer Holloway. You humiliated everyone who still believes in that badge." He sat down slowly, the edge of the chair cold beneath him, the envelope still open in his hand. That moment, he thought he understood it when it happened. He thought it was about control, about compliance. But now, looking at the still frames, he saw something else entirely. Althea Monroe had never resisted. She had never raised her voice. And yet somehow, She had become larger than the room, than the town, than even the badge he wore. And now, in the aftermath, no one had come to defend him. The police union said nothing. The town avoided his eyes. Even his own reflection had started to feel like a stranger. Grant didn't feel rage. He didn't even feel guilt, at least not the sharp kind. What he felt was something colder, something emptier. He was no longer feared, no longer trusted, no longer relevant. Not because he broke the law, but because he broke something deeper, the contract of decency. Althea Monroe had already forgiven him, that was the worst part. The note didn't condemn him. It just exposed him. Exposed the truth that he hadn't just cuffed a woman, he'd cuffed the very values he once swore to protect. And now no one was listening when he spoke. No one was asking where he went. No one was saying his name. Grant Holloway hadn't been fired. He had been forgotten. And as he looked again at Althea Monroe's face in those photos, calm, composed, commanding even in silence, he realized what true power looked like. It doesn't scream. It doesn't fight back. It simply outlasts you. The morning was pale, the kind of soft gray that hangs low after a long storm. The town hadn't quite woken up yet. Its streets still wore the quiet of what had passed, though something invisible had shifted. Althea Monroe stepped out from the police station without a word. No one followed. No cameras flashed. No officer tried to explain. Her stride was even unhurried, and yet there was weight in every step, like the ground itself acknowledged her passing. The wind tugged gently at the edge of her coat. Her shadow, long and deliberate, stretched across the sidewalk like a question no one dared ask. Across the street, Jada stood still. The girl's phone, once the tool that had captured the truth, remained in her pocket. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. She just watched. Watched the woman who didn't shout, who didn't fight back, who didn't collapse. She watched history in motion. One officer, a young man with a new badge, maybe still believing the world worked in clean lines and black ink, stood at the entrance as Althea passed. He didn't speak. He didn't move except to raise his hand in a salute, unsure whether he was allowed to, but unable not to. Althea looked at him just once. A nod. Nothing more. And that was enough. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need to call out names. She didn't turn back to see who was watching, who was whispering, who was still trying to understand what they had witnessed. Because that moment wasn't for them. It was for the air, for the silence, for the generations of women like her who had walked through worse with nothing but spine and grace. She disappeared down the block slowly until her figure blurred with the wind and morning light. No one ever said where she went. Some thought she returned to D.C. Others swore she took a sabbatical somewhere in the hills she once trained soldiers. But most didn't ask. They just remembered. They remembered the weight of those 17 seconds. They remembered the sound of silence louder than any siren. They remembered the truth she carried, not like a weapon, but like a mirror. And they remembered that she never once raised her voice. In the end, maybe that's the legacy she left behind. Not the scandal, not the rank, not even the command, but the way she walked away without needing to win. Because when you've already lived for something bigger than yourself, you don't look back to prove anything. You just leave the world to catch up. The morning was pale, the kind of soft gray that hangs low after a long storm. The town hadn't quite woken up yet. Its streets still wore the quiet of what had passed, though something invisible had shifted. Althea Monroe stepped out from the police station without a word. No one followed. No cameras flashed. No officer tried to explain. Her stride was even unhurried, and yet there was weight in every step, like the ground itself acknowledged her passing. The wind tugged gently at the edge of her coat. Her shadow, long and deliberate, stretched across the sidewalk like a question no one dared ask. Across the street, Jada stood still. The girl's phone, once the tool that had captured the truth, remained in her pocket. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. She just watched. Watched the woman who didn't shout, who didn't fight back, who didn't collapse. She watched history in motion. One officer, a young man with a new badge, maybe still believing the world worked in clean lines, and black ink, stood at the entrance as Althea passed. He didn't speak. He didn't move except to raise his hand in a salute, unsure whether he was allowed to, but unable not to. Althea looked at him just once. A nod, nothing more. And that was enough. She didn't need a podium. She didn't need to call out names. She didn't turn back to see who was watching, who was whispering, who was still trying to understand what they had witnessed. Because that moment wasn't for them. It was for the air, for the silence, For the generations of women like her who had walked through worse with nothing but spine and grace. She disappeared down the block slowly until her figure blurred with the wind and morning light. No one ever said where she went. Some thought she returned to D.C. Others swore she took a sabbatical somewhere in the hills she once trained soldiers. But most didn't ask. They just remembered. They remembered the weight of those 17 seconds. They remembered the sound of silence louder than any siren. They remembered the truth she carried not like a weapon, but like a mirror. And they remembered that she never once raised her voice. In the end, maybe that's the legacy she left behind. Not the scandal, not the rank, not even the command, but the way she walked away without needing to win. Because when you've already lived for something bigger than yourself, you don't look back to prove anything. You just leave the world to catch up. Some stories don't need fireworks to leave a mark. Just truth, dignity, and the courage to walk away without needing to prove anything. Althea Monroe reminded us that real power doesn't shout. It stands. It endures. It makes the world pause, reflect. And if we're willing, change. If this story moved you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to MMAX for more stories that honor strength, justice, and quiet resilience. Your support means the world to us. It gives our creative team the drive to keep bringing stories like this to life. Because at MMAX, we don't just tell stories, we help you remember what matters.